Hi, this is Father Bill W. I am an Episcopal priest here in Austin, Texas, and I want to welcome everybody to another podcast. And this is the final one in our series. This episode has to do with Robert Johnson's book, Transformation. We've been going through it with the help of my friend David B. out there in California. And what Johnson is trying to do, if you've stayed with us, and as a little reward to those who have stayed with us through this series, I'm not going to do the usual announcements. So there you go. We're into part two, and it's a lengthy little episode here. So we'll save as much time as we can. So the title of this series is Becoming Who We Were Always Meant to Be. And when I coined that one, it's we're studying the evolution of consciousness, and it's a difficult subject, and so we used Robert Johnson's book to help guide us through the process, and he studies three characters, of course. He studies Don Quixote, who is simple consciousness. Would that we could get back to it, but we can't. Hamlet, who is a more mature but complex consciousness, and he winds up being stuck there. And what Johnson says is that most of Western levels of consciousness are at the Hamlet phase, that they're really not touching, well, maybe touching this fourth dimension, but it's rare, it's elusive, but it is where we're going. And I think that has a good reference to what real recovery is all about. So he presents this one through Faust, and Faust opens the doorway to four-dimensional or enlightened consciousness, as he calls it. And in part one of the play, Faust makes a deal with the devil, as did we all, selling his soul to regain his lost youth. And of course, he makes a mess out of everything in act or part one, and everybody around him gets hurt in the process. There's that element as well. But now a shift has started to take place. And in part two, as we enter this, Johnson says this: it is written in the language of imagination, a fairy tale, a myth. It is only on this level that Faust can find a way out of his imprisonment in three-dimensional consciousness. The efforts of planning, reasoning, discipline, and heroic ventures. That's basically the Hamlet three dimension consciousness. These would only further the emotional confusion of a man who has attained the degree of consciousness Faust has at the end of part one. Again, Johnson warns, it is only in the realm of symbol and ceremony. Hang on to that. Symbol and ceremony that the solution can be found. So I'm so grateful. I was contacted by my new friend, David B., out there in California, who graciously volunteered to help rescue me because I was getting in over my head in Shakespeare and Goethe. But he came here to straighten me out, and I'm forever grateful for that, David. So welcome back. And are you ready to tackle part two of Faust?
All I can say, Bill, is fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Off we go. Okay.
I did. First of all, thank you, of course, once again for having me back, and I'm just so enjoying this whole process. I'm kind of in awe of it, to be honest. Here's a place where we could start. It's a kind of a reminder. The Faust story began in the West in the late 15th century, and there was actually a rumor that there was a bona fide college professor who actually was dabbling in magic and supposedly sold his soul to the devil, and so on. And that's where things kind of kicked off. So Shakespeare's contemporary, Christopher Marlowe, wrote one of the first adaptations of this folktale, in English anyway, and it's known as Dr. Faustus. It's one of Marlowe's best-known plays. And it ends in great tragedy as the title character of Marlowe's play is dragged down to hell. And in Goethe's Faust, which we're discussing in this podcast, part one almost mirrors the journey that Marlowe sends his Faustus on. In other words, we end up in a pretty tough spot. Goethe doesn't send Faust to hell, at least not literally, but he's in a hell of his own making by the time we get to the end of part one. So as we launch into the untold waters of part two, which is very rarely staged, by the way, Bill, it's not a common piece that is put onto the stage because it's so startling and it's almost unstageable in a lot of ways. Anyway, but as we head off into these new waters, it's worth remembering that Goethe was kind of blazing a different trail here. This is not a story that previously had ended in the place that Goethe ends it. So he does something very special with this folktale, and it ascends to the level of myth, which I think is probably what caught Johnson's attention.
Exactly. And then it opens the door to a vision of what this consciousness can look like.
Absolutely. I feel like part one is pre-recovery, and
Yeah,
part two is the journey towards really getting into recovery. So
that's it. Okay, so part two of Faust delves deep into Western literature, and it goes in much too many directions for any kind of an episode. Like David said, even playwrights don't even touch this thing. So I doing some research. One author said it's encyclopedic. It's like you sat down with your whole set of World Book encyclopedias or Britannica, and let's just kind of run through this and get everything onto the stage. So I thought probably the best way to tackle it is the way Johnson does, and that's using these four very strange characters who show up in the play and then help Faust on his inward journey. And let me read from Johnson as he introduces the first new character and the role that each will play in the transformation of Faust. Johnson writes this. Part two of Faust opens with a scene in the emperor's court. Gold making is in progress. There's a great deal of heat, fire, and energy, but it is not certain that any gold has been produced. A boy charioteer mounts a horse and gallops off furiously, never to be heard from again. This is the first gift. It's the pure, undifferentiated energy of the puer, the inner child of every man. When a man consents to begin the interior journey, this symbolic quest, he may expect certain characteristic experiences. For a sojourner in this nearly trackless land, to have even a general knowledge of these coming events can be encouraging. A great deal of energy is produced when one touches a symbol or a symbolic experience. Emotions flare up. Fear and exhilaration alternate, and inflations are extremely common. If you come to the emperor's court, a symbolic place deep in the unconscious, you must have enough emotional stability to withstand the intense heat and the strangeness of the journey. A guide or teacher is of inestimable aid. And so the puer aeternus, the eternal youth in every man, the divine child within, comes to the rescue of the man who has worn out three-dimensional consciousness. The kid, as I call him, points us towards fantasy, points to heaven, to the wonder and the awe, to the fun and the excitement of life that gets dried up in Hamlet consciousness. And if these elements of fun, wonder, and awe are missing from recovery, look out, look out. It's back to hell, as John said, for further boiling in the oil of transformation. David, how's that sound to you? A good way to open us up?
I think so, yes. It occurs to me listening to that last revelation that you're talking about, the necessity of fun and wonder and so on. I had a couple of different thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm.
First is that I think that I've heard it argued that along with sleep and shelter and food, wonder is actually a primal human need. Take us all the way back to the origins of mankind, and you have fire and caves, and the killing and consumption of animals, and paintings. Why one would ask the question, well, why did we need the paintings? The rest we understand, but what was that about? Well, we transpose our world into something mythical, or at least folk-like, in order to question it more. Sometimes I think, and Goethe's Faust, especially Faust Part 2, is such a great example of this. Stories are really aids for us to ask questions about the world that we live in and to stay curious. So deep down at the very heart of many storytelling exercises is this spirit of wonder, which the Puer Aeternus represents in Faust Part 2. And then, Bill, I wonder, you know way more about this than I do, but isn't there some serendipitous connection between that spirit of wonder in art and creativity on the one hand, and the space we need to get in touch with our higher power on the other?
Exactly. Yeah, it's which is what Don Quixote had, but in a very immature way.
Right.
He had it, and so the question is, how do I get back to that in an adult form?
Yeah.
But I can tap into the wonder, the joy, the awe, and I would argue also the meaning and the purpose of his life,
Right.
which he did not question. He had it, and he set out to do it. We wind up wondering, questioning, lost. That's the Hamlet phase. That's the three-dimensional stuff that Johnson says is such a killer, and it kills people in recovery. If we get lost in that Hamlet phase, if we're not in touch with that joy and the wonder and the fun of it all, the youth of it all, hey, boy, you're going to burn out in time. I did it 20 years. At 20 years, it was like, I got to find something deeper, or this is not going to work for me. And that's what set me on my course.
And I think, if you think about necessity of storytelling, it's both deeply embedded in all the great religions of the world. They're really
Right.
just an accumulation of amazing stories,
Mhm.
on the one hand, and also your average meeting down the street where you show up and you talk about what you're going through on any given day with your peers and fellows in recovery. So I find, when Johnson describes Faust Part 2 in particular as a fairy tale, he's saying to us, behold the power of stories in our lives, and do perhaps begin to ask the questions that will open up that space for you, because really that's what we have to offer one another in terms of a very, very necessary support.
That's right. And if we go to worshiping the Bible or worshiping the big book, we miss the storytelling element that's there and that is enlivening.
Exactly, because we're part of it. It never actually stops. You and
Right.
I, we keep adding more and more stories to the mix.
That's it. Yeah. So the first contact with the inner world comes through this charioteer, and he's there for a flash. So there's power and light, but then he's gone. It doesn't last. But Faust benefits from it. And now Johnson says that he has the wisdom, he has sufficient wisdom to ask Mephistopheles, can he see Helen of Troy, who symbolizes beauty and femininity? It's the consciousness that Johnson describes as holy, redeemed, enlightened, eternal, visionary. It's that fourth dimension. And Mephistopheles directs him to go to, quote, the place of the mothers and place a key in the tripod. Open the door from 3 to 4. Third level consciousness into fourth level consciousness. And the place of the mothers. What the heck is that about, David?
Well, I got very excited when I encountered this, not because I'm going to be able to explain it, but rather because I think the mystery is not limited to Goethe's Faust. So remember last episode, we briefly had cause to touch on Iron John,
Yeah.
the book by Robert Bly, which refers to the folktale by the Brothers Grimm, in which a boy is sort of absconded from his castle by a giant. Now, lo and behold, Bill, this is almost, well, the coincidence is too significant to ignore. At a certain point in the story of Iron John, the giant sends the boy back to the palace from which he has been removed. And I'm almost quoting this exactly, to locate the missing key under his mother's pillow.
Right, that's right.
Now, I can't define that any better than perhaps you or anyone else, except to know that we're in this realm of mythological fairy tale symbolism. And from here, I make a leap. I have to credit my wife with all of this because she gave me all of these books. But I have to make a leap here to Sam Keene's book, which was published in the 90s, called Fire in the Belly.
Yes.
Man, you know that one?
Yeah, I do.
And it's a wonderful tome, I think, for men in particular, but really for anybody to understand masculinity. And he makes a great point about how we as men can get very easily stuck under the influence of women, women with a capital W, as he writes in the book. And I wonder if this notion of a key that the mothers possess is something that a man needs to find and use in order to go on his own individual journey, separate from womanness as a maturing phase.
He has to break free from mother.
Exactly.
Otherwise, he stays immature,
Exactly.
take care of me, and there's an emotional incest that is really set up there.
Yeah.
My own mother was a terrible enabler, and that was her function within our family system. And I had a therapist who was wise enough to say, Bill, you have to stay away from there. I could have gone back to New York. I got sober in Detroit, of all places. But I could have gone back to New York in a minute, and I would have been taken care of. But I had to cut free from her. Otherwise, I would get sucked up into that thing. My mother did have a good sense of humor. At about 3 years sober, she sent me a package, and it was the key to the tripod, basically. It wasn't literally that. It was, she had taken an apron and cut off the strings.
Wow.
Oh, she was literate.
Wow.
I mean, it was priceless. I wish I had saved them. It was one of my prized possessions. Okay, you've broken free.
Wow.
That's what every man has to do. And what Jung would say is, if you don't, the mother complex is wanting to be taken care of, wanting to be mothered, wanting to go back into the womb, refusing to grow up.
Absolutely. And I have been, I'm a test case for that scenario, although not because I think, in my case, not because my mother imposed anything necessarily very draconian upon me, but rather because I just awarded it to her.
Oh, that's what we do.
Exactly.
That's what we do.
They
might even be very healthy. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, right? And mothers are designed to give comfort, right? And so they do their job well, and we don't want to let it go.
That's right. That's right.
Those are my thoughts around where the place of the mothers is such a fabulous, mysterious notion, but I really think there's something in it for all of us,
Absolutely, absolutely. So Now, there's a quote that I hit in this little section, and I use it whenever I give a workshop describing this transition from three-dimensional to four-dimensional consciousness. And I think it's exactly the four-dimensional existence that the Big Book references. We were catapulted into this new realm. He says, for most people, the transition from three-dimensional to four-dimensional consciousness is exceedingly painful. Medieval Christianity called it the dark night of the soul. Dante called it the journey through hell. 40 days and 40 nights in the desert for Jesus. It was a journey in the belly of the fish for many a hero. For a modern man, it is a midlife crisis, or worse, a nervous breakdown, or still worse, physical suicide. The process can be summed up in one sentence. It is the relocating of the center of the personality from the ego to a center greater than one's self, shifting from a consciousness of self-centeredness to a consciousness of God-centeredness. And for the ego, Jung says, it's always experienced as a death. I love that line from the 12 and 12. What happens if I turn all of my life over to the care of God? I'll become the hole in the donut. There'll be nothing left of me. Boy, and there is the struggle, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've heard you talk about this in many a podcast, and it's really it's right at the heart of the matter. I think that's why Faust is such an important character to us, and why Johnson's book and this series kind of has to go to this play. We can't stop where Hamlet is. Hamlet is,
right,
like many of us, stuck in a secular plane between like horizontal concepts of thought over here and action over there. But Faust is the next level. He's stuck on the vertical planes. Should he go up or should he go down? And that's the spiritual journey. And that's why this play is so very, very important. Because I feel like it's really in the spiritual realm that the ego has to meet his maker.
That's right.
So
that's right. That's exactly right. So now Faust makes a huge but a very human mistake with Helen. He tries to embrace her. He tries to have a personal relationship with her. But of course, she's an archetype. And while you can channel an archetype's powers and gifts, you must be very careful, because their power is too much for humans. And so Helen vanishes. So many mistakes that we make on this road to recovery, So we start believing too much in our own power, and we tell them that the people behind us, boy, let me tell you how it really is, and off we go on another inflation.
Another ego trip, right? So it's I can't remember if I said this here before, but I learned to think of the steps as the face of a clock, where you just keep going round and round. It's not a ladder,
no,
but it's a continual journey around. And in this episode, I think when Faust tries to embrace Helen, clearly we're in the realms of Greek mythology, which fascinated Goethe. He obviously, really, really wanted to go here and spend some time with Helen, and she's not done. We're going to meet her again in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But Greek mythology itself is littered with this idea of errors and transgressions, in particular between mortals and gods. And although that might seem very distant to us today, if you think about it from the perspective of the ego,
right,
where, all day, every day, we wish we were superhuman, basically, or we think that we are, then it's actually a very common issue for you and I. It's not buried in thousands of years ago storytelling, but it's rather happening today.
Someone said you can study, if you want to get into this world, you can study Greek mythology, or you can look at your own life.
I feel like that's exactly right. That's basically the same thing.
That's right.
And then, of course, how would we learn if we didn't make the kind of mistakes that Faust makes here? It's necessary.
It's the only way we're going to learn.
Yeah, we have to mess up.
Success, it was Jung's famous line after 35, success has nothing to teach a man.
Ah, right.
Oh, isn't that awful?
Yeah, it is. It's was so paradoxical, isn't it?
Yeah,
And very difficult to grapple with, because when you're in the middle of your failures, you know, I think many of us feel that we want to disappear down the sinkhole, but actually they're the place of greatest learning.
that's right.
Mm.
Yes, go to the plumbers. They
Exactly.
they have the wisdom. So now a second form of the puer aeternus appears, and he's in the form of a homunculus, a little thumb-sized man that Faust's assistant has created in his laboratory. And do you have any thoughts on who that character represents? Because Johnson seems to imply, he deals with it briefly, has something to do with the place of evil in our world and in ourselves.
Mm. I feel, as with many of these episodes, that enigmas wrapped up in mysteries. So I don't have a definitive
Yeah.
response, but I do think this about the idea of little people, homunculus, and other sprites and characters like that. You know, there's a long tradition of them in folk stories.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the question is, do they represent evil or do they represent chaos? If you think about the child, the mythic child, the concept of childness, we're in a place prior to socialization, prior to the rules and regulations and the law and the order that society imposes on us. The child lives free of many of those things, at
Right.
least at some point in their existence they do, and in stories they often do. So, funnily enough, the reminder I get when I read about the homunculus is from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, the character of Puck,
Yeah.
who's a little impish, wood sprite who's constantly, messing things up kind of on purpose and having a wonderful time doing it. Is that evil or is it just chaos? Is the dichotomy between good and evil, or is it between order and chaos? And that's a question that I'm curious to get your thoughts about when it comes to recovery.
Yeah.
Have we done evil or have we just slipped into chaos, or are they the same or not?
They're not ready to handle that amount of energy. It's too much for them.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating that this child of this brief union between Faust and Helen is born a young man. He goes through none of the phases, of being a baby and a toddler and a little kid. He's basically, they give birth to a teenager, basically.
That's exactly right. What a
tragedy
tragedy that is. My God. At least you got to go through the, isn't he sweet stage?
Yes, exactly. Gotta have the fun part first. But I do think you're right. Faust is learning. He's getting closer. He has more humility. I'm not sure that he's reached a condition of true humbleness yet.
Right.
But he's getting closer. But still, you can't marry a myth. Bottom line, you can't marry a myth. Ask the guys who tried marrying Marilyn Monroe, and there's the evidence.
Yeah. Oh, a funny story. I was in therapy many, many years ago with a very tough therapist, and the guy sitting next to me had been married 9 times. 9 times. I was impressed. And the therapist says to him, "Why don't you marry your mother and get it over with?"
Oh, wow.
Whoa. Whoa. He didn't grow up.
Yeah.
He kept searching for Helen.
That's right.
You can't marry Helen.
That's right. Right. Wow. Well, enough said. I think that you've just lanced that particular boil, or the therapist did for sure.
Oh yeah, I've never forgotten that one. So our buddy Faust is learning as he's going along, and here's another quote from Johnson: "A sublime event occurs. Faust embraces Helen of Troy, but she slips out of his grasp. Mephistopheles whispers to Faust, 'Hold on to her garment, which will carry you above the commonplace.'" Important line. Helen vanishes. The great archetypal vision fades away, but she has left enough of herself to activate the artistic visionary faculty in Faust. And this lesser way of possessing Helen is not too much for mortals to bear. When you know at what level and in what manner you can relate to the impersonal archetypal world, you are truly safe. Then creation can begin. Powerful, powerful.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
It
Oh.
should be tattooed on the eyelids of every artist. Uh,
Right.
because it's so easy to overreach. I think that's what he's describing. Yes,
It
that
is. It
our
is.
capacity
Yeah.
to overreach ourselves, and that, hubris is really the concept that he's addressing, which is a ancient theme in drama. Of course, so many Greek tragedies are all about our capacity, our ego's capacity to inflate, and what goes horribly wrong when we abandon ourselves to that.
Which is normal for a youth to
Yes.
inflate.
Yeah.
A necessary part of the process, but deadly after a certain phase, after a certain stage.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And
So,
of course, it's not just in creation of the arts, although Johnson talks about that, as we'll hear in a moment. But it's in our lives, it's in our everyday lives, it's in our relationships, it's in the way that we function. What is the right size as opposed to overreaching is really kind of an important question.
and there's a dynamic that's going on between the ego and the shadow, between the ego and the archetypes. All right, and so you have to know at what level you are operating and what is the function of your ego. It's lovely. It's lovely to go to fantasy, but you can't live there. It's lovely to draw the strength and the beauty and that from it, but don't try to possess it. Those are the lessons I think he's trying to make, teach us here. It says many an artist has failed his calling because he refused a limited, less than perfect expression of his original vision. A man cannot handle the great artistic tools of the boy god Euphorion, and he may not be able to embrace the superhuman vision of pure beauty, Helen of Troy. But a man can touch Helen's garment, which is sufficient to bring a small part of his artistic vision into creation. To do more would burn us up in gigantic inflation. So if I can't write the perfect novel, I will write no novel at all. If I can't find the perfect mate, I'll just keep having affairs. So on and on I go without learning to live within the limited human sphere. See, that's back to Don Quixote. That's the refusal to grow up. Yeah. So, and in that sense, the Peter Pan syndrome, the puer aeternus, gets stuck in immaturity. You can draw that strength from the kid, and he keeps you in touch with that divine element. Jung talked about the divine child inside of us. Yeah. But there's a place for the ego within this. How do I balance those two? Well, it's everything.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, first thing I have to say is guilty as charged. And then, the Peter Pan syndrome that you're talking about, and all of Jung's writings, it's such a complex and or delicate balance. We have to learn to meet our inner child as adults. We have to kind of return and meet that child, but we're not supposed to become it.
Right. That's right.
We're the adult who is now charged with protecting it and giving it the space to inform us and inspire us, but now in an adult form. So yeah, I mean, it takes Faust a very long time, because this is a very long play, to get even close to that, and I can say that's true of my life too. So
that's right.
It's really a hugely important statement on what it means to grow up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Post-critical naivete is the line from Marcus Borg, I believe, is where I first came across that.
Hmm.
It's like you cannot. It's like the Christmas stories that you read. Well, once you start growing up, you start questioning that, and you lose it because this couldn't have happened, and that couldn't have happened, and this couldn't have happened. But is there a way to go back to it through imagination, through spirituality, to get the deeper lesson of what is being expressed there? You know, I think some of those authors were wise enough to speak to us in that way, and we were dumb enough to take it all literally.
Yeah.
And then you lose it. You lose it, you know?
You talk about, you just mentioned imagination and spirituality in the same breath.
Yeah. Oh, they go hand in hand.
Yeah. How many times have we, well, speaking for myself, and I'm still young in recovery, as we talked about before, but you sit in a meeting and you hear people talk about their higher power, and so many people are still continuing to grope for a definition, which is not necessarily a problem. At least it doesn't strike me as a problem, but rather it's just, you watch their imaginations kind of, you know, cranking into gear. Like, how do I define this thing?
Yeah. Wrongly is my, you will define it wrongly.
Right.
Don't let that stop you.
Yeah.
You know, because it'll grow and it'll change.
Mm.
You know, someone wrote many years ago, I don't know if frogs believe in God, but if they did, you can be sure God would be green. So we project onto the image that which is deepest and richest in ourselves. That's all we're capable of doing.
Yeah.
And it's not enough.
Right.
It doesn't come close to touching, you know, but best we can do.
Yeah. And I suppose the act of trying or permitting that kind of space inside of us in our struggles to define is part of what spirituality is. Questions and more questions and inner space.
Right. And don't be afraid of using imagination in that capacity. Jung said active imagination is more powerful than dream analysis and work because the ego must participate in the process. It's brilliant.
That's brilliant.
See, when you're asleep, your ego is checked out. But when you're awake and you're doing active imagination through prayer, which was what I think two-way prayer is basically about. It's if God were to speak, what would he say? And then allowing that to come through you. And then every once in a while be totally surprised by the source of wisdom that you have found within yourself. The great reality truly is within, you know? Wow. But it's fun.
Yeah.
It's fun. I mean, I was you know, for 20 years, I was out there doing prayers, talking, and nobody was coming back to me. Got very boring, you know? Now my prayer life has just taken off. God talks to me every morning, you know, and I write it down. And, it's great fun. And, you know, you'll enjoy this in keeping with Faust. Sometimes I listen to Jesus as you know, that's my deal. But sometimes when I come and ask a question, what I hear back from my God image is go talk to the kid. You don't need to talk to me. You need to hear from the inner child. And see, I think there's a mirroring that goes on there, that as I get in touch with the divine that is within, then my job is to go to the kid who is within and heal some of those wounds that fester inside of everybody. And you can get a lovely divine tap into that, but it doesn't do you any good. You have to go to the kid who's in there struggling and hurting. And I think in that way, a kind of mirror what I'm doing in my two-way prayer is what I'm doing in my inner child work. That is a necessary part of, I believe, one's prayer life and one's coming to wholeness. But it's another whole episode, isn't it?
Well, it's not just an episode, it's a series.
It's a series on that one. Yeah.
I would like a front row seat to that series, please. So,
Okay, absolutely. Well, bring your kid. Bring your kid.
yeah, we'll do.
It's a matinee, so we'll have fun. So time is going along in the podcast and in Faust's life. He's growing old, so I can identify with this guy. And we find him sitting by the sea, reclaiming land, like the Dutch in Holland. Johnson writes, the true work of a man in the latter part of his life is the cultural process of bringing up some of the contents of the unconscious and integrating them into consciousness. This is the process symbolized by reclaiming land from the sea. Mephistopheles arranges this quite easily for Faust, and we soon find him dredging canals, building dikes, taking land from the sea and adding it to the landmass. He is happy and content with this project and is deeply absorbed in it. He finally has attained some measure of peace. But then, as he always does, he blows it. There's a couple with a cottage on his property, and damned if they're not blocking his view of the sea. He complains to Mephistopheles, who goes and frightens them to death, burns down their cottage and the small chapel that they've built. Any insights in that one, David?
Yes. My insight is that contentedness is impermanent. And I do actually. I think that's a point that gets made in a couple of different ways as we reach the end of the story. Even when we think we've arrived, we aren't actually going to stay in some kind of a condition of ecstasy. We're going to keep vacillating between, the place of serenity and the place of non-serenity.
To learn our lessons.
That's right. This episode dramatizes that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Faust goes back to digging, but he's now blind. And Johnson says he doesn't realize he's digging his own grave. Aren't we all? And in the final scene, Faust's digging has resulted in the creation of a utopia, a happy land, reclaimed from the sea and filled now with happy people. Faust pauses, and he says the words he has avoided saying for some 24 years, linger, thou art fair. As soon as he does so, Mephistopheles rushes in, claims his soul according to the terms of the contract. He's found peace, joy, and happiness, and he's found it in the joy of others. Significant. But he lost the bet. But did he really lose, is the question some would ask, eh?
Well, I think the key is what you just observed, which is that he's not only found peace in himself and for himself, but he's found peace in relation to the opportunities he's given to other people.
Yeah.
And as we see shortly when he climbs the steps to the pearly gates, that might be the very thing that tips the balance, because it's no longer selfish or self-centered. It's become something greater than himself. So even though he loses the bet, he may have ascended to a position where he's sort of surpassed his limitations.
I had a wise old man in early recovery. I went to a meeting and it was a lousy meeting. And I came back and reported it as such to my sponsor. And he said, "Oh, yeah? And what did you contribute?"
Oh, no.
Oh, no, I went there to judge.
Yeah, exactly. I contributed a tremendous amount of criticism.
shut me up on the spot, you know?
Wow.
And now, just as Mephistopheles is about to go and drag Faust down into hell, Gretchen appears, and she's at the head of a band of angels. She's the woman, if you recall, that Faust treated so badly. Hey, the woman who suffered so much because of him. And she intercedes for Faust at the very gates of heaven. The gates open and Gretchen leads Faust in. Johnson says, in the end, it is grace, not justice, that prevails. The masculine stuff of law and order and justice are superseded by grace and love. And I suspect at the end, if we arrive at those pearly gates, none of us will be let in by what we've done, but by what's been done for us and given to us. In the end, it is a gift. Why me? You know, what did I do to deserve this? Why am I getting it when so many others are falling by the wayside?
Well, this section makes me think back to the story of Faust as a whole and his efforts to achieve some kind of earthly perfection, fulfilledness. But in the end, it's actually our imperfections that define us.
Yes.
There's a great book by, this would make an amazing investigation, Richard Rohr, the Breathing Underwater, where he talks about the 12 steps in relation to, biblical reference points, and talks a lot about that. You really have to kind of crash and burn in order to move through, as we see in these great stories as well, to a place where grace is something that's possible for you. And then I don't know how this may or may not be relevant, but I just can't help but make this reference to Nelson Mandela at the peak of his, of his life, when he's finally awarded the presidency of South Africa. What does he do in his inaugural speech? He forgives the prison guards that kept him under lock and key for 27 years or however long it was. I mean, what an astonishing
he got it.
Example. Exactly.
He got it.
Exactly.
He got it.
Yeah.
So the scene is in heaven, and a fourth and a final puer figure arrives. And the point here, Johnson says, is this: if we're going to be redeemed, it's all of ourselves that must be transformed. And that includes our dark side, our inner Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles catches sight of a young angel, an innocent, sweet, loving as he could be. His heart is touched, and he too is being transformed. Johnson concludes, Faust is redeemed by the love of Gretchen. Mephistopheles is redeemed by his first experience of love. Ego and shadow each find its own level of redemption and its own appropriate salvation. The boy angel symbolizes love. It is the fourth manifestation of the puer aeternus and sums up the power of that figure. To touch the puer is to touch eternity, to touch love, and to be delivered from the time-space world that India labels as Maya, or illusion. The play ends with these words: all that is perishable is but an image. Here, the short-reaching becomes result. The indescribable, here it is done. The eternal feminine draws us on. Johnson explains, this is more than a hint that wholeness is not attained by means of masculine law or contract. It is a gift from the eternal feminine aspect of God. Faust is saved by the very bungling of his attempts at love, by his perilous journey to the place of the mothers, and by the fidelity of Gretchen. no less miraculously, his lordship Mephistopheles, that dark part of our human capacity that we call the devil, is saved by the first stirrings of love within his dark bosom.
Wow.
Wow. Wow.
It's hard to put words to this sublime vision.
Yeah.
Other than to say, as is your intention in this series, that something about this journey, this epic, complex, mysterious journey that this fictional character of Faust is traveling, has a relationship with the real journeys that we are on in recovery. Many failures, many mysteries that we don't know that we'll ever resolve, many challenges that seem to be beyond us, and yet grace and mercy possibly lying ahead of us, whether or not we deserve it. So that's fascinating.
Absolutely. David, I want to thank you for your help in guiding us through this. I know I could not have done justice to the play without your help. And so let's see if we can't maybe dig up a few more pieces of literature. Maybe Iron John would be a wonderful one.
Waiting for us. I'm sure we'll have some good ideas.
Yeah, I'll give you a break. I know you have another job out there in the real world, but if you want a flight of fantasy, do come back. And I want to thank you guys for staying with us in this series. I know things got a little deep in parts, but I hope we've been able to maybe help facilitate a deeper understanding of the fact that sobriety in the end is really a gift, and that in the end, it's really learning our lessons from the tragedies and mistakes of our life, as David said, and that it is a gift in the end, and that it's really all about learning how to love, and that's kind of the great reality inside of us, doing for us what we can't do for ourselves. And maybe as a final thought, it's about all of those mothers and grandmothers out there who prayed for us, through our trials and tribulations, and never lost hope, because that's what it's about too. So their prayers were answered. The eternal feminine, as Faust says, draws us on. So God bless you all, and do keep coming back. Don't know what the next series is, but this will be a tough one to follow. So thanks again, David, for your help on the journey.
That's
really enjoyed.